Hello, my name is Mira Chandler-Fonk, and for my final project I made a caliper case, with strong hinges and padding for sound damping, since those are both issues with my current case. The first components were two pieces of the outer shell made from vacuum-formed ABS plastic. Earlier versions of the design used a thicker material and countersunk screws, but I changed that later in the design process to make it both easier to cut and to drill. I also gave the part a large taper to allow for easy removal from the buck, and I gave the part large radii to make it easier for the plastic to wrap around the sharp corners. Thermoforming for this part required some additional steps. It had an undercut, so I made a separate piece, shown here in blue, that forms the undercut and then can rotate out easily. I also placed holes in the buck so it could be used as a drilling jig for the hinge holes, and I kept the buck in the part even after cutting it out of the shell so I could use it as a guide for trimming down material. Using the flush cutters is not the fastest way to do this, but it is the one least likely to gouge or crack the part. The next parts up were the metal hinges. There is an axle side and a hole side to the hinges, but I took care to make them as symmetrical as possible, only needing to change the hole types and positions while repeating the same outside milling steps for each. I also made the axle for the hinge a set screw, since that is much more easy to install and replace than a dowel pin or the like. Manufacturing the hinges took a lot of steps, but the first part was cutting out as much of the outer profile in a solid bar, then cutting the four hinge parts out of that bar. The next part was using a work stop to hold each hinge at the same place on the mill so that I could quickly repeat operations like drilling or tapping for each part. The final component is the rubber case linings. A lot of the work to make these manufacturable was done when making the shell that it sits inside. The shell means that the bottom half of each mold is common between the parts, and that the mold has a large taper on the outside. I was still cautious to add a taper on the inside pockets as well, however. Manufacturing was a fairly straightforward rubber casting process. I used Vitaflex 60 rubber for a mix of durability and softness, and I made sure the molds were sealed and applied with mold release before casting. Finally, I added a bit of dye to the rubber to get that nice orange color. Finally, we can place magnets in each lining to help hold the case closed. Then, glue each lining inside a shell half. I found cyanoacrylate works best for this purpose. Take all of that, add some bolts, and we have a finished caliper case.